Good morning and welcome to our Boardroom Bites at 9 session. Our topic for today is complex risk, landscapes, directed duties, and navigating the new normal. And our speaker for this morning is Jess Schulschenk. Jess, very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us and going through some topical discussions. Jess is part of the Embedding Project in South Africa. She's a director of the Sustainability Institute, and she lectures at Stellenbosch University. So Jess, I'm really looking forward to hear what you have to say. Just in terms of our first poll, we would like to find out from our members that are attending, what sector do you currently operate in? The poll should be showing on your side, and it is a multiple choice, so you can pick more than one. We would just like to see what's the representation here this morning. Which will help Jess as well in terms of her presentation. So we'll give this a few seconds while everybody completes. So far, it looks like our financial sector representation is the highest. I'm going to give that a few more seconds, just wait for about 80% completion. Further, I see you cannot see the poll. You can put your answer in the chat group if you like. The options is construction, government, financial, manufacturing, retail, agricultural, minerals and energy, trade, or in the non-profit sector. So if anybody can't see the poll, you're welcome to just pop that in the chat group so we can just see where you're from. Awesome. I'm going to stop the poll now and I will share the results. So far, like I've said, it looks like majority of us attending this morning are from the financial sector, thereafter followed from government and non-profit being the next two high-ranking sectors. So Jess, I'm going to give you control now and say goodbye, and I'll join you guys during the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vicky. And a wonderful good morning to everybody. It's lovely to be with you here on this webinar with the IOD. Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation today and hoping that we can make it as interactive and really responsive to the kinds of questions that you have in whatever way that the topic elicited your interest, but also the kind of different themes and trends and issues that we'll discuss. So I'll share a bit for about half an hour, just really the latest findings from our research. I'll explain a bit about the Embedding Project and the work that we do, and then really start to look at it from the perspective of directors and trying to make that shift to understand risk not just as an unfolding dynamic, but something that increasingly we're responsible for making sense of and responding to proactively. So maybe just a bit of background. The Embedding Project, we're a global non-profit research initiative. We've been going for over a decade now and really responding to the challenge that we found in academia a couple years ago, which is that academics often research things that they have access to or they find interesting and hardly ever deliver it back to companies or practitioners in a way that's really useful. So if anybody has done their own dissertation or seen or read someone else's dissertation or an academic journal, you know they're not the most accessible or action-oriented guidance. Yet we really do need rigorous research to understand unfolding trends, what in practice really helps move things forward, and how we can start to bring all of these insights and learnings back into practice in meaningful ways. So our work is part, like I said, of a global network. In South Africa, we're based at UCT's Business School with my colleague, Professor Ralph Hammond. In Canada, we're based at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. In the States, we've got a team at MIT. And in the UK, we've got a team at Cambridge. And so we're a global network of academics that work very, very closely with business to understand what are the unfolding challenges and to almost in a way kind of co-create practical guidance based on real world experience and actions that we're seeing happen. A lot of our work the last 5 years has focused a lot at a board level. And so we see that whilst there can be strong and good teams in-house, the understanding and ownership of these issues from a board level is really important. And what we're trying to make sense of is really this landscape of unfolding risk. So many of you might be familiar, for example, with Porter's 5 forces. It's been taught in business schools for a long time. And what we're saying today is there's an additional 2 forces that we all need to make sense of. And we'll chat a bit today about what those are, but really understanding large-scale environmental and social trends and how they affect our business in really tangible and rapidly changing ways. So before we get into that, I'd actually love to ask you a question. And if you can head across to the chat function, so you should just be able to find the chat somewhere. And if you go there, I'd love to hear in one word. So if you can think of just one word, what is your sense of the state of the world today? It can be good, it can be bad, it can be anything in between. So this is fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm seeing a lot of the words coming up. And if you've already put in your one word and you've got a burning second word, you're very welcome to put it in. Yeah, seeing a lot around kind of uncertainty, chaos, mess, turmoil, challenge, complex, volatile. And I know many of us may have heard or seen the term VUCA being used increasingly often, an old military term: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But in some ways, I think that makes it seem like if we can label it, then we can handle it. But actually, as leaders for organizations and for society in general, this is an incredibly difficult context that we're operating in. And so sometimes when I ask this question with kind of young student audiences, there's a sense of optimism. So I love the word, Busi, that you've used there, exciting. So we might, see possibility or the potential for innovation. But actually, it's a highly unsettling period because both these things are happening at the same time. So the systems that we've always depended on or taken for granted seem to be in many ways coming apart at the seams. If you read the work of Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, we look at whether it's democracy, capitalism, any of these big isms that we've taken for granted almost in the last century. A lot of them aren't panning out the way that we thought they would. We're seeing high polarization, really quickly moving challenges that are coming through. So I, for one, am not a kind of a specialist in epidemiology, and I certainly did not see kind of COVID coming and the impacts that it would have economically globally in this time last year, well, this time last year for sure, but in January last year. And so in many ways, this is what the World Economic Forum puts together in their annual global risk report. And so if we look at the 2020 map, for example, so in 2021, they happen just to not visualize it in this way, but all the decisions, the strategy, and the plans that we make as businesses or organizations unfold within this complex web of interacting risks. And I often think of this almost like a spider's web. If you tug at one of the threads, it has a ripple through the system. And so what we're starting to see is a continuous set of reinforcing and kind of interdependent risks. And the ripples through the system are really significant. So even if we want to think of something like the COVID pandemic, we can trace it back to land use change and the fact that we have destroyed a lot of natural vegetation, thereby increasing the encroachment of urban spaces and the interaction between wildlife and human, to the extent that we've brought those pathogens into our urban spaces and with global travel, how quickly that moved. But really the two big things that we're worried about here is climate action failure and social instability. And so there's a lot of complex drivers that give rise to these issues. But this is what we might define as, and we talk about this in academia, as a set of wicked problems. So a problem that no one person or group of people created by themselves, a problem that everyone is affected by, and again, a problem that no one person or group of people can solve by themselves. And so if we have a look at the evolution of these wicked problems, and really just to remind you, this global risk report is defined by both country and business leaders globally. What are people most concerned about in terms of both impact and likelihood. And so why I bring our attention to the 2019 report, for example, and you see this evolution over time, this makes sense for, we see 2008 recovering from the global economic crisis. It gets pretty colorful, but increasingly a lot of these global risks that country and business leaders are concerned about can be classified as environmental. And I sometimes argue it doesn't really matter if it's pink, purple, red, green, or blue. If it's a major risk, we really need to be understanding it and ensuring that we have proactive strategies to both mitigate and adapt to those risks. And so what's interesting in this report is if we have a look at what's happening here around failure of climate action, natural disasters, extreme weather, the report basically said humanity is sleepwalking its way to a catastrophe. And this was pre-COVID. COVID has been one of those major catastrophes, and we're starting to see others unfolding in real time. When I was studying climate change, oceanography, quite some time ago, almost 2 decades ago, we were thinking about it as a concern for grandchildren, and not our generation, maybe not the next, but definitely the following. Today, these issues are real and they're unfolding kind of month to month, week to week. And so we need to shift our understanding and start to make sense of how can we plan with these unfolding risks in mind. And so I want to take a bit of a step back, and I kind of I pick up on Marina's word in the chat, which is sad. It can sometimes be, and we'll look shortly at a bit of the science, it can be really overwhelming to think about the scale of the challenges that we're facing as a global society, and hard to make sense of what our next steps could be or should be. But I want to be optimistic today and share with you examples of companies that are doing this in really fantastic ways as well. This image was taken, I think, in 1968, the first time that a picture of the whole Earth was taken from space. It's called the Blue Marble. And there's so many things we could talk about, but just really briefly, what's important to me is the sense of we've only got one of these. And that's not some environmentalist agenda or some greenie perspective. It's just a hard truth. I don't happen to be in the economic bracket that Elon Musk is, so it's highly unlikely that I'll be buying my ticket to Mars anytime soon. But even if I could, I'm not sure if that's what I'd want to. And so for the longest time, we've based our economies, our industries on a very linear way of operating. We extract resources, we use them, and we dump them, if we want to be that honest. And in some ways, we've had interactions with communities and society that are not that dissimilar. And so the major shift that we're noticing in corporate strategy is one from linear to circular, and starting to think about kind of ecological and social issues as not separate, but as something that we're an intimate and interconnected part of. So one of the ways in which we make sense of this is the work put together by the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stefan and other amazing scientists, who've basically done a health check for the planet. So imagine you go to the doctor for your annual health check and you want to know, is your blood pressure, cholesterol, all of those things, how am I looking? And so if we were to, if the planet was to go to its GP for its annual check-in, the doctor would have not the best diagnosis. And again, this is not scaremongering, it's just the harsh reality that we work in. And so here we see that we basically want to stay within the green zone. That is a healthy, functional, living planet. And not for any other reason than we depend on those conditions. As we enter into the yellow zone of, we're starting to push up against limits, the ability of the earth to continue to accommodate us. And as we step into this orange zone, it's almost what has been defined as beyond the zone of certainty. So we're not sure if we can step back into the yellow or green. And so you'll notice we are pushing up against the limits of climate. And we basically are calling this the decade of action. We have 10 years within which to halve global carbon emissions. And the science is telling us we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. Yet we have overstepped on areas such as phosphorus and nitrogen, So those working in agriculture would be aware of the large-scale impacts of this. And through the changes in land use, we are very, very far over on biodiversity. And so the science on this is a bit more complex, and therefore we don't often pay it enough attention because it can be hard to understand some of these concepts. I just want to point out that there's at least 3 areas or ecosystem services we don't even have the science to measure. So we don't actually know where we stand on those. And as I share this, it's interesting to me because I think what I'm hoping to do here is to flag for your attention. These are not necessarily issues you need to solve as a director, but they're questions that we need to be asking. And there's a lot of work at the moment supporting boards to ask questions around climate. And I anticipate that there will be soon coming work around biodiversity, biogeochemical land system use as well. And so if you want to think about this, the IODSA team was asking me, what is this slide about? So a friend of mine has a wonderful way of explaining limits and thresholds. And I borrow this from him, which is imagine that you've got the wing of a plane or the wings of a plane, and we've got these tiny rivets that hold the wing in place. We know that we can lose 1, 2, 5, maybe even 10 rivets, but we don't know at what point we lose so many rivets that the wing is going to come off. And that's what a boundary looks like. We can't say with perfect science, okay, we can afford to mess up the ecosystems 27%, and then we'll still be stable and everything will be fine. These boundaries are blurry. And so we need to adopt the precautionary principle, which is to say, we want to keep as many rivets in place, because if the wing comes off the plane, we're all in trouble. And so for me, this is quite a shift in mindset, because I think environmental activists have done a poor marketing job. We often talk about saving the planet, but actually the planet will exist long after we are gone. It might look very different, but it'll be around. It's really, we need to kind of figure out how do we keep this home base of ours in a healthy, stable condition, conducive to us having a quality of life that we desire. So Kate Raworth and a team from Oxfam did some really great work. It's been adopted by the World Economic Forum. And what they've done is bring together this notion of ecological sealing, or these ecological limits that we need to live within, and combined it with the necessary social foundations. And so if you think about in South Africa, we are really concerned around issues of food security, of employment, of inequality. And we can't afford to only focus on issues of climate without at the same time addressing jobs and the stability of the economy, education and healthcare. And so we know that societies where everybody has basic access to minimum social foundations, such as jobs, but also equity, voice, democracy, we know that everyone in that society is better off. And so how do we work in a way where we maintain minimum social foundations and we adhere or operate within these ecological ceilings? And so you might laugh, and I'll share with you a wonderful TED talk as a resource if you want to go into this a bit more. Kate Raworth talks about this as being the donut. So if you look at this green circle, it's this idea that we need to figure out how to live within the donut. And we're starting to see countries adopt this at a national level. Cities like Amsterdam are assessing how can they operate within this safe and just operating space. And the work that we do with global companies, including some big South African firms I'll chat about, is really trying to make sense of how do they commit to operating within the safe operating space. And it gets really complex. So how do you as a director know which of these to focus on? How do you know where you're exposed to risk? And not just risk that's already unfolding, but risk that might be unfolding in the next 3 months, 3 years. And so this is a lot of the work that we do, is trying to create practical guidance, processes, benchmarks, databases, case studies of what this starts to look like. And mostly our work here is supporting heads of strategy, heads of risk, or heads of sustainability. But we have a special kind of set of work we do specifically with boards, and that's around supporting them to ask the right questions. I want to kind of just come to this question, and again, I'd love to ask you to just pop in the chat, what are the major unfolding risks in the South African landscape that you're either seeing from the industry you're situated in, or just your sense of what are the issues that we need to be aware of specifically in South Africa? So again, absolutely, Helen's kind of picking up on the unemployment. Sure, and I get goosebumps as I see that connected with exactly what Clive and Bussy are talking about, which is energy security, and then specifically with this kind of youth bubble coming through. So a big issue that we're working on at the moment is something called a just transition. How does South Africa as a country move to a low carbon economy? How do major players like Exxaro and Sasol support this transition? So we need to move away from fossil fuels towards renewables, but we can't flip the switch overnight. So that's the transition. We need a transition to a low carbon economy. But the second and the kind of absolutely critical part of that is, how do we do that in a socially just way? How do we actually create more jobs, not less jobs? How do we ensure energy security and job security at the same time? So I'm just going to kind of follow through on some of these other trends that are coming up. The inequality challenge, we have of the highest inequality in the world, the highest Gini coefficient. We tussle Brazil, but I think at the moment we're probably number one. And then all of this becomes undermined around issues of corruption, politically, in corporate across the board, which is really this question of ethics. And Lunga, I think, when you talk about social unrest here, that's exactly what we saw in that World Economic Forum's interconnected map. Social instability, but really what you're saying is much more spot on, social unrest. And sometimes I think of this as, imagine you go to the doctor and you're sneezing and you've got a headache. If you go to a decent doctor, they're not just going to give you a painkiller and an antihistamine. They might say, you've got the flu. This is pre-COVID. And if you go, and you might be prescribed something like antibiotics. And so that's almost like when we see uprisings like Fees Must Fall, service delivery protests, often we just knee-jerk reaction, like, okay, we have to quell the protest. At the moment in Cape Town, I don't know if anybody's here, but there's massive issues. Nobody's able to move around because of protests that have shut down many of the highways this week. And so our prescription of antibiotics might be something like new legislation. We need a new education policy. When we start to recognize that unemployment is driven by issues of education, healthcare, social services, all kinds of things. But kind of coming back to that metaphor, if you go back to your doctor 3, 4, 5 times, continuously getting sick, your doctor hopefully won't prescribe you just antibiotics, antibiotics, antibiotics. Your doctor's going to start to ask some questions and say, what's going on in the lifestyle that you have, your stress levels, the decisions that you're making, that you keep getting sick? And I think this is the kinds of questions that we need to ask as a society, which is, how come our policies, our legislation, our investment practices are not shifting the dial? How come we're not seeing, as a country endowed with magnificent resources and ingenuity? I am so proud to be South African for our incredible wisdom and creativity that we can demonstrate. How come we're not really able to make any kind of meaningful impact on these massive issues that deeply affect a business's viability? And so that's almost the mindset that we need to start thinking about, which is, what would deep change look like? And then the question is, what role can we play in facilitating or supporting that deep change? Because not just in the long run, but even in the short run, it's what we all need. So each of these inputs that people have given, including the role of digital transformation, the fourth industrial revolution, I think there's so much we could unpack in each of these contributions that everyone's added in the chat. And my sense is very much the same as yours. These are the big issues we're grappling with. And so the question is, how will these affect your company? How do boards take the opportunity to adopt or to carve out time to think about these issues? I know often board agendas are so full that we don't always take or make the time to unpack some of these big themes. And then, really 2 kind of small anecdotes I want to share with you is really starting to understand that we're in it together. And I think that there's a broad recognition we're seeing, whether it's in corporate or in civil society, is the sense of we're in the same boat, and it's in our individual and collective interests to be a part of the solution. So I have a huge love for a deep ecologist called Aldo Leopold. If anyone's familiar with his work, Thinking Like a Mountain, I would really recommend. It's a beautiful read. But he talks about ethical behavior is doing the right thing when no one else is watching, even when doing the wrong thing is legal. And I think to add additional pressure to your role as leaders is there's limited guidance from legislation to tell us what to do. Our carbon tax has moved too slowly. We don't even have kind of clear guidance on issues around how we can contribute and address inequality, unemployment. It's not sufficient. And so what do we do when nobody else is telling us what the answer is? And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, there's no perfect equation. But this is the kind of the front edge of strategy making at the moment. This is the frontier, that's the word I was looking for, of evolving strategy. And in many ways, this is also deeply affecting an evolving understanding of director liability and duty of care. And so increasingly, we're seeing globally a trend where directors are liable for not just the strategies or the actions of the organizations that they sit on, but actually for the issues that they did not address, and how that affects the company as a whole. And so very quickly, we've talked about it. There's a lot more to unpack here. So if this is something of interest, I can share more resources. But we're seeing a major shift in logics. 10, 20 years ago, it was really people, planet, profit, triple bottom line. And John Elkington, who came up with that term in a Harvard Business Review article a couple of years ago, says he wished he could take it back. He was kind of on the spot and he just, he thought it was a nice way of framing it, but actually it's inadequate because it makes us think we can have one or the other. And then some of you might be familiar with the work of Porter and Kramer. In 2011, they published the notion of shared value, which is this kind of space in the middle, win-win, good for business, good for society. And if we're lucky, sustainability is that little tiny sweet spot in the middle. And again, it's a great stepping stone. It's helpful to open our minds and our thinking to win-win opportunities, but it doesn't recognize that we have one planet, and if we destroy it, we will not have the ability to continue with business. And equally, no business can exist without a healthy and functional society. And so as we start to look at this logic of what we're calling nested dependencies, it's how do we make decisions with the logic or the understanding that we depend on the environment and society in order to be around. And therefore, it's in our best interest to ensure that they are in a stable, resilient, and ideally generative state. So the major shift that we're starting to see, and I'll give a couple examples of global firms that are doing this, is a move away from what can we do to what do we need to do. And so what can we do approach would be something like, we can reduce our carbon footprint by 5%. But if I was speeding to the edge of a cliff and you were sitting in the passenger seat and I said, you're like, whoa, we're going to fly off the cliff. And if I tell you, don't worry, I'm slowing down by 5%. I don't know if that would be good enough for you. It wouldn't be good enough for me as a passenger. And so what we're saying is we need to really base our decisions in science. We need to halve global carbon emissions by 2030, and we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. So we are seeing companies like Toyota Global committing and taking action. Maersk, the global shipping company, Microsoft has even committed to addressing all historical carbon that they've ever been responsible for. BlackRock has come out with a very progressive carbon position statement. And really people are moving into the space of what do we need to do. Mars, the global confectionery, and kind of, they own a lot of different brands that we might know. They talk about rooting their decisions in scientific understanding of what is needed to solve the problem rather than what we can only achieve in the short term. And so this is a big question, I think, for you to be asking is, are our positions, our goals and our targets, our strategies, are they responding to what we've always done, which is an incremental approach? Or are we truly operating in the space of acting in an appropriate response or scale that is required to the scale of the challenge? And not just because we are taking a bold leadership position, but because unless we do that, we are going to be in an increasingly unstable context for the next 5, 10, 15 years, and certainly thereafter. So I want to close in the next few minutes, just because I'd love to have time and space for conversation. Your questions, what's coming up for you. And so if you're starting to think on those questions, we'll put those into the chat just now, and Vicky will help so we can start to open that up, the conversation. But before we do, just to kind of close out on this, is why are we seeing global firms do this? Why has Exara and Woolworths both committed to a science-based target on climate? And we're seeing Woolworths start to move in the space of water and others as well. Why are companies paying, like Rio Tinto, Tech Resources, some of the global mining firms we work with, why are they paying such acute attention to an evolving understanding of human rights beyond just what the Declaration of Human Rights is talking about? Why is Sasol trying to figure out the role that they can play in becoming part of the low carbon economy? And I know we don't always see that publicly, but from a lot of our conversations internally, there is deep work underway trying to make sense of how companies can transition. And so 2-3 years ago, we were asked by a lot of the companies we work with to understand how boards shift, how boards become part of the solution, and what would that take. And so we ended up doing a global study interviewing over 300 global CEOs, board chairs, directors of companies, as well as heads of strategy and risk. And that included a big sample from South Africa as well. And there were 3 big reasons why we saw this. The one is to manage disruptive risks. And so we're seeing much more rigorous scanning happening by heads of risk, heads of strategy in companies. And this is supported by boards asking better questions. Enhancing societal acceptance is this notion that we've moved far beyond compliance and legislation being the major drivers of decision making. Yes, it's a minimum standard that has to be in place. But in fact, we're seeing investor pressure is considerable, and consumer or stakeholder expectations are increasing day by day. And then the last piece is an interesting one, which is setting defensible limits to your involvement, such that when someone says, well, why aren't you, sponsoring the hospital or healthcare or doing these other kind of necessary or important areas of work, you can say, well, we're a car manufacturer. The big play that we have, our big risk exposure is in climate. We're both a major contributor, and we will be affected if consumer and investor pressures change the game. And so therefore, as for example, a car manufacturer, the big area that we need to contribute and to be a part of the solution is in climate-related transition. And that, for example, is the work that I've been seeing with Toyota, as well as areas of water, circular economy, recycling, biodiversity, and education. So why are we doing something, and then kind of why is that therefore okay that we're not doing others? And so I guess my last offering is 3 things that I hope you can take away as really tangible actions. The one is to ask the right questions. And I'll share, we can do a little follow-up with some useful resources. CPA Canada has issued a really helpful guidance of 20 questions every board director should be asking on climate change. And so it's just about asking the right questions and supporting EXCO and others to be able to develop the strategy in a way that is more risk resilient, more forward thinking, and kind of has scanned a little bit more broadly. The second thing that we're asking of boards is to endorse position statements on key issues. It really matters when a board can sign off on a carbon position statement, on a human rights position statement. It means that this is the new kind of set of rails to guide decision making for the organization. And so we've created a database of what we consider to be the best position statements globally on a range of environmental, social, and governance issues. And we've also created a guide on how to write an effective position statement that really takes into consideration issues like planetary boundaries and social foundations as well. And then the last one is to support credible goal setting. So if you want to think about the example of me driving like a crazy person to the edge of a cliff, and saying, don't worry, I'm slowing down by 5%. If your organization comes forward and says, don't worry, we're going to reduce our carbon footprint by 5%, I think it's our responsibility to say, that's not good enough. We need to be rooting our decisions in what the science is telling us is needed. And that is increasingly what will be expected of companies as well. And so again, we've created a database here. All of our resources are publicly available online for free. So we're a public benefit organization, and where we have cataloged what we think are excellent examples of credible goals, again, across all of these different issues and major unfolding risk areas, and creating a guide on how to go about this goal setting. So it's not the responsibility of the board to set the goals, but it's my sense of it is the board needs to be asking, do we have a credible goal setting process? And are we publicly communicating those? So yeah, that's a lot. We've covered a huge amount of ground in a short amount of time. So I'd love to open that up and say, is there anything from maybe what I shared that we want to get into a bit more detail or questions about it? And really just a reflection or a question to you, which is, what does this mean to you and your role? And yeah, ultimately, what you'll see is my contact details here. I hope that this is the start of a conversation. So it's not to say we can solve all these issues in an hour, but yeah, we would love to be in contact and to be a part of the conversation to say, how can we, or how can you support your organization to address this unfolding risk landscape? And maybe just as a closing is, this is what is increasingly being expected as your duty of care. And so there is a need. We see that board members often have incredible financial literacy. You wouldn't be on the board if you didn't understand a lot of complex financial, political issues. In the last 5 years, social and environmental issues have just come so strongly to the fore that we are seeing a need for boards to improve their ecological and social literacies as well. And that's a big ask because we weren't educated about these issues in school or in most universities. And so, yeah, I think that's a big area for development coming up as well. But Vicky, let me maybe hand over to you and then we can see what's coming up in the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jess. I'm just going to move that back to Q&A. Okay, cool. Shall I go through some of the questions that are on there? We've got some on the Q&A at the moment. If anyone does or would like to ask their question live, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. And I see I've got Doris and Charles who's got their hands raised so far. So if your hand is raised to ask a question, you can keep it up and I'll enable your talk functionality. So Jess, I think let's have a look. Our first question is from Gordon. We often conflate world with humanity / Homo sapiens. Is that not a key issue?
That's a great question. Hi, Gordon. Nice to see you online. And I maybe thought I can pull this together with Paco's question, which is, you're so right. And that was what I hope to communicate is the world will be fine. The world is a kind of complex ecological system that will exist after we're gone. As a human species, we have some introspection to do. And so, yes, Homo sapiens, if you read Harari's work, he also talks about, are we evolving into Homo Deus because of the role of nanotechnology and all of this. So Paco, one of the questions I often ask is kind of, what does it mean to be human? It's a question we explore in our degree, and it's even a question that's coming up in companies. So I don't know if I saw this here, was it Lisa or somebody else who said, surely the question we should be asking is one of purpose. And I sometimes wonder whether we're not so caught up on this runaway train, and we're busy trying to tinker with the engine and get the train to work a bit better, that we're not even asking questions about where this train is heading and if that's the direction we want to be going in. So these are really big, almost existential questions, but they have a place in our lives and in our work. And so there's a beautiful metaphor that I read years ago about a wisdom that comes out of the Sand people, who talk about the difference between a big hunger and a little hunger. So we have a little hunger for things. We want a bigger house, nicer clothes, better car, and that's not to deny that we should all have homes and mobility and kind of a beautiful life. But the big hunger is a hunger for belonging, for purpose, for creating meaning in the world, for relationship and connection. And I wonder whether sometimes we confuse the two. And so we get so caught up in trying to meet our big hunger with little things. And I wonder whether in companies we do that as well. We're so busy tinkering with trying to make incremental improvements, more efficiency, more this, more that, without asking really big questions around purpose. So I'm sorry that I don't give any answers, but I just completely agree with your questions, and I think it's the questions we need to be asking.
Thank you, Jess. Charles, I'm going to enable your talk functionality. There we go.
Thanks very much, Vicky, and thank you, Jess, for a great presentation. My question involves the topic of integrated reporting. So the Institute of Directors and, of course, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and other institutions have done a lot of work to promote awareness as well as the practice of integrated reporting, taking into account the broader set of capitals. You spoke about the environment, issue of relationships in society, and of course, employees, taking account of all of that. So my question to you is, in your research, in your interaction and engagement with organizations, corporations in South Africa, and of course with your colleagues in the other regions, the United States, Canada, and the UK, as you mentioned, what's your sort of observation in terms of their reaction to this, in terms of their adoption, and the extent of embedding? Yeah, if you could just maybe comment a little bit about that.
It's a great question. So it was probably about 5 years ago. I was based up in Joburg, actually at the time with EY, who was sponsoring a study on the history of corporate governance in South Africa and the evolution of integrated reporting. And that came out of two professors from Harvard Business School. You might be familiar with some of their work, Bob Eccles and George Seraphim, who were extremely interested in how this country at the tip of the African continent was the global leader on integrated reporting. Because at the time they were saying, we need all companies to move to integrated reporting. And they were really interested in understanding how South Africa got to that point. So it was a huge privilege to be involved in that study. We did a 20-year review with the IOD on governance, kind of interviewing all the way through all the King reports, the evolution of integrated reporting. At the time, I was also involved with EY's Excellence in Integrated Reporting Awards. And so we were reviewing reports across all listed companies and applying the IIRC's guidance to try and make sense of what constituted good reporting. And so I'm a big fan of integrated reporting. I think it is not so much the outcome as the process that can be very useful. And so you can think of it almost like a Trojan horse. It's an opportunity to bring the organization together around really understanding and articulating through the lens of whether it's multiple capitals, what is the organization's impact and what is its potential to improve performance. But I think integrated reporting falls flat when we rely on the materiality matrix to, materiality matrices were designed to help us know what to report on. It was never intended as a tool for strategy. And so, Jeremy, I see your question here around risk register and development of that, because what we're seeing is that an integrated report is the outcome of what is and where we need to. So I think, Charles, to your question, what have I seen globally? When we looked at a comprehensive portfolio of 60 practices to embed sustainability across an organization, across almost all practices and across geographies and industries, we saw leaders and those with room for improvement, except in one cluster. Across all those organizations, we had about 22 multinationals in the study group for 3 years. The one area everybody was struggling was not reporting, it was not brand, it was none of that stuff, it was on strategy. And so unless we get our strategies right, and we need to start there with a much more comprehensive understanding of risk and scanning, prioritization and acknowledgement before we move into goal setting and into position statements and things like that. So that's where I think integrated reporting is not, it's important but not sufficient. And we need to go a bit more upstream to understand, have we developed an appropriate comprehensive risk understanding that is less reactive? And do we understand where our blind spots are, and are we committing to research and processes to get to that better? So we have produced a really comprehensive risk prioritization radar. We actually, so we did it with Rio Tinto globally last year. We're busy working with Sasol on it at the moment, to have a look at that process and see if we can put something out there that is really moves us far beyond the materiality matrix style. So if anybody's interested in that, really welcome to reach out to me direct. It's not yet on the website because we're still developing, we're kind of testing it a few more times. We are very nerdy researchers, so we don't like to release anything that's not perfect. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the answer. I just want to maybe pick up, Vicky, while you're also looking, if I can jump to Richard's question, which is, if biodiversity is one of the biggest risks, why is it getting so little attention? Biodiversity is regionally quite specific, whereas climate is something that has global ramifications for everyone. So and biodiversity is a little bit harder to understand. We need to have regionally specific baselines, and really know what are our critically endangered areas that provide fundamental ecosystem services. And so that needs to almost be done at a national, or for a company. We've seen Tech, I mentioned earlier, is a Canadian-based global mining firm. They've done very, very good baselines in all the regions where they operate. So I'm glad you flagged that, and we're busy producing an issue guide on biodiversity, because it's something that tends to get lost in the sciences. And I love scientists, they're my people, but we're really terrible at communicating. So scientists by and large have done a poor job of getting this onto the agenda of companies. And we need to flag it as an important issue for research and understanding.
Thanks, Jess. There's two questions from Carolyn and also from Richard as well. Around, so Carolyn asked, as a small company, how do we measure our company's carbon footprint or impact on the environment? And I think linked to that, Richard's question is, are there tools or methods for balancing the limited impact a company can achieve through its efforts alone on climate change compared to, for example, the impact it can have on unemployment? I appreciate they are not mutually exclusive, but one can measure the comparative impact of a rand's investment.
Both excellent questions. I've just typed into the answer for you there a link to the carbon footprinting guide that Nedbank produced in partnership with the Sustainability Institute. We also run a short course on that. So for smaller companies where you might not have a dedicated person working on that, many companies have used the Carbon Disclosure Project for a long time. But to your question, Richard, the biggest guidance at the moment is coming from the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And so we've seen huge adoption in the financial services sector. And I was chatting with Clicks the other day, they're busy working on their TCFD disclosure as well. So that was really a move by the Financial Stability Board to improve our transparency on climate risk and exposure for all companies. And so if you're not already connected with or familiar with the work of the TCFD, that would be a starting place. And then the other is Work that's been led in South Africa by the World Wildlife Fund, but is globally unfolding in something called science-based targets. And so they've got a lot of very clear guidance on how to do for carbon, water, and I think there's a working group on biodiversity, a really practical set of tools on how to understand your immediate impact as well as your extended value chain impact and what should be appropriate goals that you're setting. So I would say it's a combination of using our risk prioritization radar and then guidance on how to therefore set, understand baselines and set goals in response. But just while Vicky is scanning, I'll drop those links in the chat for you as well. And maybe, Vicky, if it's useful, I can put together a little resource pack of the different TED Talks, the guides, the resources and the tools that we can send to everyone.
Thanks, Jess. I've put in the Nedbank link into the chat group already. Charles has asked for the EY report, but yes, we're happy to, we will send an email, thank you email out to all the attendees, which will have the slides and the video links, so we can also send through any links and other items that you'd like to share with them. So there's a few more questions on here, and I see Paku has his hand up as well, and Sipokazi. So I'm gonna maybe allow Paku in the meantime, if you wanna ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation, Jess. I agree with you that yes, integrated reporting need a broader picture of assessment of risk. And that limitation is increased even by directors and management who don't take integrated reporting from the input level throughout to the output level. They think they can just ask an accountant to come and prepare financial statement at the output level without seeing the whole thing going through the process, all the processes. Thank you very much.
No, I agree completely. And I think that's where I think of it as a Trojan horse. It's either a compliance exercise you do with little value, or it's a process you can use to really think upstream, downstream, and improve the quality of your strategy. So I don't know, actually, to someone's earlier question, whether EY still does the Excellence in Integrated Reporting Awards. I just want to point out that a good award is not the same as good performance, or a rigorous strategy that takes into consideration unfolding risks. So sometimes you can have a report that meets all the guidelines for what a good report is. It's concise, it's uses the multiple capitals framework, it's honest, it's this and that, but it doesn't mean that as an organization you've got a really solid strategy to address unfolding risks. And I think, Paco, if I hear you correctly, you're asking the same, or kind of pointing to the same issue. So I kind of stepped away from the focus on reports, and what ended up, so my PhD was starting on integrated reports. I wanted to look at to what extent could integrated reports help shift and shape culture, leadership, and strategy. And what I realized is they couldn't. They were simply an artifact, and if the process wasn't done well, they weren't that impactful. If the process was done well, they were helpful. But I think to Clive's question, is the greatest risk today not the quality of our leadership? And because my research adopted a method called grounded theory, so I wasn't allowed to assume the answers. I had to, based on observation and what was really happening, derive conclusions and theory. And so what I found in the 21 South African firms I studied over 4 years, across, again, different sectors, and that was, it was really a question of leadership, and not that leaders are malicious or unable. They've got to where they are because they're extremely competent at what they do. But often their understanding of the system has been informed by a historical experience. And now we're saying the system looks like this. And so what I noticed was there were skilled individuals inside organizations who help leadership to broaden their understanding of the system. And one of the directors we spoke to said, once the penny drops, or once you can see how these dots connect, it's impossible to return to the way that you thought before. And so I think it's not about forcing people to, radically shift strategy. And it's about understanding the system in its broader context. And once you do, it's a very kind of hopefully natural recognition that strategy needs to shift. But I do want to hold space for the question around ethics. And so years ago, I spoke with Dion Rousseau, who's the head of the Ethics Institute. And he said, it's too late to try and talk about ethics by the time that you're a CEO or a chair. Like, actually, we probably need to be doing this in schools. So I don't have an answer to that, but so there's one is systems thinking and the ability to develop rigorous strategies. But the other is kind of the elephant in the room for me is ethics.
Thanks, Jess. I see Gordon's got his hand up. He's also had 2 questions on the Q&A. So Gordon, I'll let you speak in the next minute. There's a question from Clive and Jeremy. Clive asks, is the greatest risk today not the quality of our leadership? And Jeremy, can you buy carbon credits to offset some of your footprint?
Cool. So I think hopefully, Clive, I kind of spoke to that a bit just in terms of leadership is, I wish I could say that it didn't matter. If you have a great team, it doesn't matter what your board does. All the research suggests it really matters. So how do we bring leadership on board? How do we draw on their skills and their expertise and make them part of the solution and not the problem? And so I think for me, that was kind of this notion of broadening our understanding of the system. And then, yes, carbon credits is a part of the solution. So there's companies in South Africa like South North and others that specialize in carbon offsetting and carbon credits. I know there's a couple people from agriculture and retail here, and we're seeing amazing shifts in agriculture that's becoming net carbon sequestrating. So here by us, Spear has recently received carbon credits because the way in which they farm stores more carbon than it produces. So that's quite exciting. And then we're also seeing with WWF some really exciting projects around bankable nature solutions. And so how you can actually invest in ecosystem restoration in a way that's financially rewarding, while at the same time building up the resilience of the systems we depend on. So I know I'm kind of throwing them all at you very, very quick, but I'll try and put those together for you in the resource list, because those are some really fantastic evolutions that we're seeing emerge at the moment.
Thanks. Gordon, you can ask your questions.
Hi, Jess. Good to see you, and thanks for a wonderful presentation. Yes, so just thinking the Limits to Growth report, Danella Meadows was part of that team, and it's really, she's probably one of the leading thinkers in, sorry, I'm just struggling to hear me.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you can just start again. I didn't catch that, sorry.
Yeah. I was just thinking the Limits to Growth report, which the Stockholm Resilience Institute has picked up on and is driving now. Danella Meadows was part of that initial team, and she really does talk to systems thinking and the paradigm shifts. And, whilst ethics is important, I agree that ethics is really important as part of an education process. Systems thinking really does pick up on that as well. And I'm wondering if you don't have a comment on that, and her looking to paradigm shifts, which are either, stepwise or quantum leaps. And whether we're not going through a quantum leap at the moment, and hopefully that gets speeded up.
Yeah, so I get very nerdy about this kind of understanding major system changes. And I came across the work actually through Margaret Wheatley of someone called John Glubb, who looked at the rise and fall of civilization over 250-year cycles. So if you're kind of interested in historical perspectives, it's a really fantastic read to help us understand how we're probably in an era of collapse, but that's the very same moment that the new order emerges from. And so absolutely, Meadows' work is fantastic in the space systems thinking, but what it opens up for me is the need for brave leadership. One system is collapsing, a new system is emerging, and it's up to us to write the story of what that new system will look like. And in fact, the energy from this current system's collapse becomes the feedstock for the building of a new system. So it's a pivotal moment. We are extremely privileged to be alive in this decade because we get to make decisions that have a real potential to change the trajectory. And I find that really exciting. So I just want to maybe close out in response to the 3 questions that are left. David, I'll try and find some resources. We focus largely on the corporate sector, so I don't have specific guidance for the nonprofit, but I'll try and see if I can pull some things up for you. And then I think lastly, the two beautiful questions from Nanda and Vuyalewa are, it's exactly that. We can't separate our humanity as someone who works in a company versus is a citizen, is a family member. We're all the same person. And years ago, we interviewed somebody who said the company they work in, they feel like they have to check their ethics and values at the door when they go to work. And that was heartbreaking because we're a magnificent species. We have such potential for empathy, creativity, kindness, innovation. And if we feel like we have to leave that behind as we go into our places of work, we're missing out on something spectacular. So last little reference, if you haven't read Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind, it's a very optimistic view on the human species and that we're actually a pretty cool bunch. But I hope that you take that forward in your work. If I'm sure you already do, because you're asking those kinds of questions. But integrating our wholeness, I think, is a beautiful part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Jess, for an interesting session this morning. If I can see from the chat group already, everyone has been putting some positive remarks and really felt this was a great discussion. And it looks like a lot of our members and attendees would like to continue the discussion for longer as well. So as you'll see on your screen there, Jess's details are there, so you can get in touch with her via email or LinkedIn. And if you want to get more involved in what she's doing as well, you can contact her there. We will share with you the slides as well as the video recording and all of the items that Jess has mentioned. We will share with you those links through an email. So just look out for that during the course of this week or so, and you will definitely get all of those resources. So thank you, Jess, so much for attending, and thank you for all of our members for joining us this morning. And hopefully we take a lot of the insights and suggestions and recommendations you've brought this morning, Jess, into what we're doing in our businesses. So thank you very much. Great.
Thank you so much for having me, and warm welcome to everyone to reach out. I'm very happy to be connected directly.
So we will see everyone again soon next week. Thank you very much.